And we are officially recording. Seamus, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How about you, Billy?
I'm doing well. It's a lovely day down here on the farm at the cabin. So it's blue skies and like 80 degrees. It's kind of warm for what it's been the last few days, but it's good. Which actually, how's you're in Eastern PA, right?
Northeastern PA.
Northeastern PA. Okay.
Yep. I'm about. You'd like it here, Billy. It's reminiscent of the Ozarks. We're about an hour and a half from New York.
Yep.
But I can literally walk 27 miles from the back of my house to the back of Gifford Pinchot's house, and not cross a road if I choose to. So it's a wonderful location.
That is kind of how it is out at the cabin. I've got a national forest across the street from me, or dirt road from me, so I can just go out and walk, and I've got 1 million acres of public land out there.
Yep.
So it's good. Which reminds me, an interest that we share, though I currently am without one. How's the motorcycle riding this time of year?
Well, first of all, how dare you be without one?
I have
It's wonderful.
How late can you ride there?
You know what? When I was younger, I didn't mind riding all year long. You know, we have 1 week here a year where it gets to be 0 and below, or had. We haven't had that in a couple of years. But the rest of the year, I would ride year round. I'm doing that less now, just because I'm old. But I'll ride until early December. And as long as there isn't snow, I'll ride.
I would say, do you have a bottom temperature that you'll go out in?
This stage of the game, I won't go out below freezing.
Okay.
If it's below 32, I won't go out because I don't feel like wrestling with a bike on ice. It's literally that.
I don't blame you. Yeah, when I first started riding, I was riding with a group of guys, and it was sort of like we were trying to be as hardcore as we could, and we all had our little biker vests, and we said we were doing any weather, and and there was those days we took a trip up to Eureka Springs one time, which is way up in the Ozarks, and it was 26 degrees the entire trip, and it was one of those you would grab the exhaust pipe, warm your hand up, just grab the exhaust pipe till it got through the leather, and you started to get hot, and then you let go, and then you just kind of alternate.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I actually got frostbite doing that one time. I went out with it was in the teens. I was much younger. It was in the teens. I was riding from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania to New York.
Yep.
And I forgot gloves. Yeah. Dumbest damn thing I ever. Well, no, not by a long shot, but close. Yeah.
All right, so I have like a whole list of stuff that I was going to. I have a very unorganized scratch pad of things I was going to talk to you about today. First of all, since you just lit up, that's tobacco you grew, correct?
No, this is not the tobacco I grew. I'm still curing most of that. I tried some the other day to see how it worked out, and it was surprisingly good. Yeah. I did about 50 plants, and it's the first time I tried. I did it because of the pandemic, because I figured, you know what, everything's going to shut down. We're on the eve of destruction. I'm not going to be able to get my my drum, so I'll raise some just to be on the safe side. But I actually enjoyed the hell out of it. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
So you think it's going to be just a thing you just do from now on? Just grow it?
Yeah, I think so because it's surprisingly good. It was, it's a burley, but it's smoother than I had expected, and it's milder than I expected. This stuff like my grandfather used to smoke, or smell, tasted like hair clippings and dung, But like this stuff was actually not half bad.
Okay. All right, so here's where I just want to jump in. So, and by the way, something I figured out in the first two of these I've done. There's probably like a 2-second delay from when you're talking to when I'm talking. So sometimes we end up talking over the top of each other. But just so you know, that's there. You are one of these guys. Johnny Sane first told me about you a few years ago. He was
Johnny's one of my heroes.
He's such a good guy. He was actually, I met him because he was in my class, and like, he was this guy, the philosophical hillbilly that he is. He just decided to go back and get a journalism degree, and so there's this dude, it's my age, sitting in the back of the class with this goofy grin on his face the whole time, and he, over the course, we were talking about how he wanted to get into writing professionally and get serious about it. And at some point during all of that, he was like, yeah, there's this guy I know, his name is Seamus, and he's invited me up to his place, and there's going to be some writers, and I'm like, he's like, I don't know if I should go. I was like, dude, if you've got somebody like that up there, just go. Like, forget everything else.
I had never met him.
Yeah,
I had never met him, Billy. We had exchanged on Facebook, and he'd shown me some stuff, and I thought it was damn good.
Yeah.
And we do this thing. You probably know this. Your listeners know. We did this thing up here called the Camp Kaczynski Annual Tray Fest, and we just invite pretty much anybody we knew, and we'd end up with 100 people up here. And I'd never met Johnny, and he packed up the family and drove 1,700 miles to show up at my place. And it was just one of the most delightful visits I've ever had. It was great. It was wonderful.
Yeah. So, and then he started talking about you, and then we became friends on Facebook, and then it's been, you're just one of those guys that I really like to follow, because one of the reasons is you help me kind of keep perspective on what's going on in the world. I guess you're probably the closest person I know that's kind of cut from the same cloth as Hunter Thompson. It's just,
I'm flattered to hear that.
It's that sort of, in newsrooms, sometimes you just got one guy out there who's just sort of the take no prisoners and, roll your own and let's just go do this. And, that's the world that he was in. And that's the guy that you always are. But the thing is, even though you've got,
he and I shared a seat. He and I shared a seat at the 1988 Republican convention.
Oh, well, dude, go ahead and tell that story, because I'm not.
Well, no, it was just by that point, he was kind of persona non grata with the Republicans, yep. And I was nobody, and so they just stuck us up in the balcony at the 1988 Republican convention, which was in New Orleans. Mix Hunter S. Thompson, New Orleans, and the first Bush administration, and you got a lot of colorful images around there. But,
so what was that convention like, just sitting next to him?
Well, he was funny as hell and really sharp and really incisive. This is a little crude, but my favorite image of the convention was this. If you know New Orleans and you know Bourbon Street, it's after I believe it was the third night. Okay, and one of those barkers was out in front of one of the strip joints, with the pamphlets trying to get people in, and there were these two little old ladies who I actually recognized from the South Carolina delegation coming down Bourbon Street. Okay, and it's got to be 90 degrees, and these women are dressed to the nines. They are the typical South Carolina dames. And they're coming down, and they're right next to each other, and they've got to be in their 80s, and they're just aghast at everything they see around them on Bourbon Street. And as they come closer and closer to this strip bar, they've got these big buttons on that say Bush 1988. Okay, and the barker runs up to them and he turns around and goes, "You like Bush? We got Bush." The look on their faces that will always be my pride memory. Okay, from that particular convention.
New Orleans is just one of those cities that has always retained who it is. Like, it doesn't care what anybody else thinks. It's going to be New Orleans.
I always say there are two cities in the world that are exactly what everybody always told you they were, and they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. One is New Orleans. It is exactly what everybody always told you it was, and the other is Jerusalem. And they are on opposite ends of the spectrum, but they are the only two places I've ever been that nobody ever exaggerated about.
My first real experience with New Orleans is I got sent down. I was newly hired, and I got sent down to this conference I was in the French Quarter. It was in October, and I didn't really think much about it. I was just went down there, and turns out we were there over Halloween. And so we got down to the conference, and honestly, I was pretty naive at this point in my life, and it was like, I think I'll just go down to Bourbon Street tonight on Halloween. I saw things that night I'll never ever unsee. And I won't forget the next morning I woke up and I flipped on the news, and they were looking, somebody had gotten killed that night, and they were, and kid you not, they were looking for somebody who was dressed up as a beer bottle as the suspect. God bless this city. It is what it is.
The first time you go to New Orleans, you're kind of surprised the Confederacy of Dunces is actually a documentary.
After Katrina, a lot of those, Hurricane Katrina hit, a lot of those folks ended up coming to Arkansas. We ended up, because that's when it was one of the things when Huckabee was governor. He got tired of the Bush administration's lack of effort and sent a bunch of National Guard C-130s and buses down there, and they legitimately filled up like every camp, church camp they had with people, and so food got a lot better here, and the culture got a lot richer, at least for a while. So yeah, it was sort of an interesting.
There's a New Orleans diaspora there, Houston, and I'll tell you what, the food also got a hell of a lot better in Savannah too. Savannah's kind of become sort of an echo of old New Orleans too, in a way that it never was. So yeah, there was absolutely a Katrina diaspora.
Well, since we're kind of talking about national tragedies and whatnot, let's put something in context for me. You're somebody who has history. Something I was thinking about, because I've been working on doing the border stuff for the past couple of years, and then
I love that stuff.
Do what?
I love the stuff you showed me.
Oh, thank you.
Very, very.
Well, one of the things that sort of occurred to me, so talking to an editor, and we can talk about editors later. With the first pitch, it was like the response I got was, we don't need another book on the border, and also by the time this thing comes around, Donald Trump, there's a very good chance Donald Trump will be out of office, by the time this thing might hit the shelf. And I remember that hit pretty hard for me. But the other thing since that time is I've sort of recognized in the world that we live in right now, the border, the impeachment, all of these things seem to have fallen into the background. Like, it's like those things seem to have happened in another lifetime ago. And I don't think there's ever been a presidency or just an era of time, at least in my lifetime, where I can feel like that much stuff happened that was major, and then just a few months later, people seem to have forgotten it. Now, as somebody who's done this for a while, like, put today's world into context.
That's a challenging question. And the reason it's a challenging question is, Billy, we've been through every one of these crises before. Every single one. Mm-hmm. We've just never been through them all at once.
Right.
Before. And so what that does, let me digress a little bit. And in the new book, there's a chapter called The Fog of War and Peacetime. Mm-hmm. And what it's really about is trauma.
Okay.
And how trauma expands horizontally through space. Okay, it expands from one person to the next across space, but it also expands vertically through time. And what I mean is it's handed down from one generation to the next. This is something you and I have discussed on Facebook. There is a culture of trauma in various aspects of American culture. The trauma of slavery, the trauma of defeat for one side in the Civil War, the trauma of the upheavals of the 60s and the 70s. These traumas continue through time. And what ends up happening, I think, in a situation like this is you have so many discrete but interconnected traumas visiting us as a people at once that you bunker a bit and you become focused on taking one step ahead of the next. And I think that is collectively what's happening in America right now. It's not that we've forgotten these things. And what we'll do is what people in trauma always do, which is once we are through it, and we will get through it.
Right.
We will get through it. Once we're through it, we will weave together a narrative that if it doesn't explain it all, it at least turns around and gives it a form and a structure, which we can then begin to internalize, which we can then begin to use to respond to the crises that remain. And so, I am, as cynical as I may be at times, and I am, I am at my core a tremendously optimistic human being. I am at my core a person who believes in the grand arc of history. And I do believe that the fact that all of these things have come together at the same time is going to produce a narrative, a story of us. We are the stories we tell about ourselves, and it's going to produce a story of us that allows us to do something that we haven't done in a very long time. The reason we're dealing right now with the crisis of, and I'm not going to hide my political orientation by any stretch of the imagination, the crisis of corruption that we have in the White House right now. The reason we're dealing with the kinds of really, really challenging racial issues that we're dealing with right now. And the reason we're dealing, frankly, with this battle between a kind of fundamentalism versus a kind of enlightenment sort of approach over issues of science, be it on climate or the pandemic, is because we haven't addressed these things in the past. It's because every time these have come up in the past, we've wanted to move on. We haven't called people to account. We haven't called ourselves to account. The narrative that emerges out of this, I think, just by virtue of the fact that it has become so critical with all of them, all of these unresolved issues now turning around and resurfacing at once. I think that's going to force us once and for all.
Yeah, there's a lot of deferred maintenance that's happened as society, and that's and one of the things that I've really noticed, it's come from different perspectives, is the weaponization of a lot of those issues. So those fault lines that we haven't addressed, those fault lines have been weaponized in a way to divide and conquer per se.
Commoditization of victimhood and grievance. That's what it ultimately comes down to. We have created, not only have we not resolved them, and we did not resolve them, frankly, for, I think, admirable reasons. The idea was each time we went through one of these discrete crises, we turned around and said, okay, well, in the interest of national healing, we're simply going to move on.
Right.
Okay. And I think that was done often with the best of intentions. The problem is that it left these things unresolved. You're right, deferred the maintenance. And more to the point, I think what it did is it left open the possibility for a cottage industry to grow up and fan these grievances, make these grievances this sense of individual uber alles, all of this stuff. It didn't just allow it to continue. You're right. It weaponized it. It turned it into a commodity. It turned it into something that we trade on. Okay, it became something that we play to. It became something that we use for advantage. It became almost a currency of the realm. And at the center of it is a kind of cultural narcissism, individual and collective, a kind of cultural narcissism that I think is deadly. I think is absolutely deadly.
So what do you think the way to resolve this? I mean, what does that look like? What does that process look like?
Well, you mentioned history. Historically, when it's been done in the past, it's been done with a sense of moral awakening. And that happens, that also, can become a destructive force. But I think you reach a point where you have a critical mass, where you have enough people turning around and going, no, we are in danger. We cannot go through this again. We will not go through this again.
Right.
The way you turn around and create out of that some kind of action. The first step to that is the story. The first step to that is the narrative. The first step to that is the grand arc of the tale that tells us this is who we are, this is where we have gotten, and this is how we got there. And I think you're now at a moment where things are so critical, where so many things have happened at once, and where the consequences are so obvious to at least 2/3 of the American people. But we're ripe for that kind of narrative. And that's the first step. The first step.
When you talk about trauma, I just think about one of the things I misspoke, and I told a student last one year, or it was a couple of years ago, and this is 18, 19-year-old student, and I was like, the thing about your generation is you haven't encountered like a major crisis in your life yet. You haven't had your 9/11, you haven't had, but when I misspoke, it was because I didn't think their entire life had been growing up in the shadow of those things. They hadn't hit adulthood when these things had happened, but I've got students, they're 18, 19, well, up to, 24, 25 years old. And their entire life has been dominated either by war, economic issues, so we had 2001 had economic, we had 2005, which had Hurricane Katrina. Then we had the financial collapse in 2007, 2008, and then it just has kind of gone on and gone on and gone. What I didn't think about for them was, that they weren't encountering it as adults, they were encountering it as children. But what's happened is those tragedies or issues have really much shaped their entire life. And now as they've hit adulthood, now we're where we are now. So which leads me to believe, you hit a point where you're like, enough's enough. I just sort of feel like you've got to make a change in some form or fashion, which I guess, does lead to decisions for like populism, where you either get like a moving more toward a Bernie Sanders type of candidate or a Donald Trump type of candidate, because you're looking to do something that's going to break this cycle.
I'm going to disagree with you slightly.
Okay.
And I'm going to disagree with you slightly for this reason. You have historically a generational handoff that takes place. And it usually runs, they tend to be 40-year cycles. Okay. Historically, there or thereabouts. You had a delayed handoff to the generation that comes after mine. And I have I'm fortunate to have a unique perspective on this. And the reason is because I've raised two sets of kids. Okay, I have an older daughter, two older daughters, one who's in her mid-20s, one who's 30.
Mm-hmm.
And I have two younger children, one who just turned 19 and one who's about to turn 16.
Okay.
Now, those kids, the two older kids, there is less of a generational difference between myself and them. Because though there were epical historical moments during the course of their lifetime, there was not really a wholesale change to the underpinning of the country. Mm-hmm. From the time that I was in my teens to the time that they were in their early 20s. Okay. Or late teens and early 20s. 9/11, I believe, was the trigger for a whole cascading series of events. Mm-hmm. And they completely changed the game. Okay. You can draw a line from 9/11 to the election of Donald Trump. Okay. You can draw a line from those. And so my younger children grew up in a very different world, even than my older children did. Okay. But they still have the same parent figure. Mm-hmm. They still have me.
Right.
Okay. And I'm of a generation, I mean, Jesus Christ, look at me. I am an old white man. Uh-huh. Okay. And we have been unusually, historically reluctant to relinquish our authority. I'm not going to call it control because we haven't been in control in about 2 decades now, mm-hmm. but at least our authority. And we have not given, I think, that next generation a chance to rise to the moment. You've heard me say this, Billy. I mean, one of the reasons that I've written my last book is precisely for that reason, because I think it's time for us old white guys to sit the hell down and shut the hell up and get out of the way, and let that next generation rise to the occasion. I think they're capable of it. Now, the first step when you do that is always when you begin to exercise authority. My generation did it. The next generation, to some degree, did it. I mean, look at the number of young people who did vote for Donald Trump in 2016. Right. Look at the number of people who have been attracted to a populism on the left. The first step when you do that, when you begin to turn around and say, I demand autonomy over the affairs of my generation, is you throw the furniture through the goddamn window. Uh-huh. That's the first thing you do.
Right.
Okay. That's not the last thing you do. That's not even the next thing you do. Okay. As you begin to turn around and assume power and assume control, and as we begin to relinquish it, which I think it's going to be wrested from our hands in about 3.5 weeks. Okay, finally. Once that happens, you begin to turn around and become somewhat more practical.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that a lot of the populism, particularly on the left, is impractical. It's not. It may need to be packaged differently. It may need a different narrative. Mm-hmm. And it would also help if the avatar of it wasn't another old white guy.
Right.
But,
that's what we got.
It's the beginning.
So,
right.
All right. So all of this, okay, everything that we've talked about right now, my students are journalism students. And plus the other side of this is I'm just throwing these things out publicly. So I'm assuming other people in general public are going to watch and listen to these things. Um, Part of my objective is one, to talk about the state of journalism in the world we have today. Two, what you were talking about, where it's the narrative that gets written now, and like what's and so my sort of the question is for my students. I'm asking on their behalf, like, what's a young journalist to do these days? The state of, it's easier to make more money in PR. It's easier to go on Instagram. I say it's easier, and take pictures of, whatever. And then,
Yeah.
or you can do the hard work and learn how to write things. Long form investigative journalism, a lot of the stories that need to be written. So if you're a 20-year-old, how do you get there?
We've professionalized journalism. And I think that was, I think that's had some tremendous benefits, no question about it. What I mean professionalized is we've moved it away from what it was.
All right.
What it was when I got into it was basically a blue collar trade. Okay, it was a craft. It was you made a story the same way you made a table, or the same way you tore down a straight six, and you learned to do that by working with somebody who knew how to do that. I still believe that is an absolutely essential, not just skill. It's part of the lifeblood of this country. It's part of the lifeblood of this democracy. Okay. Now, if you're thinking you're going to get into journalism to get rich, go into PR. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you're thinking you're going to go into journalism to be famous, go into PR. If you're motivated by the fact that you just enjoy the discussion, you're driven to tell the story, just tell the story, then go into journalism. And when I say go into journalism, you tried it. There are far fewer opportunities to do this now than there used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I started off when I got into journalism, Billy. All right. You had journalism schools and respected journalism schools, but for the most part, journalism was the French Foreign Legion. You drifted into journalism because you had failed at everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And you ended up at some small newspaper someplace where you started to learn the ethos of what it is to be a newspaper guy. I was lucky because I ended up at a little paper on the Bay Shore of New Jersey, and I always. The guy ended up being the best man at my third wedding. Was my editor at the time, and he had started this paper from scratch, from nothing, in this kind of hard scrabble area. It used to be old fishermen and longshoremen along the Jersey Shore. And I remember I came in. What we used to do, and this was the best school you could possibly have. I would go into work. We were a weekly.
Mm-hmm.
I would go into work on Monday morning at about 9:00, and I would work. We delivered the paper to the press at about 2:00 in the morning on Wednesdays. Okay, and I would literally, Billy, most weeks work straight through from 9 a.m. on Monday
Mm-hmm.
to about 2 a.m. when I would put the flats in my car and drive them 40 miles to the press. Okay, to have the paper printed. In those days, you used to be able to smoke in your office. I had a glass ashtray next to my desk, and about once a month, the ashtray would explode from having had so many cigarettes in it. Okay, but I remember coming in one. We would be off on Wednesday, and then we'd come back in on Thursday. And I remember we'd be off on Wednesday, and we'd come back in on Thursday. And I or on Wednesday. And I remember coming in one Wednesday morning, and it was about 9 o'clock, and my boss, Dave Thaler was his name, was standing in the foyer of the paper, and the plate glass window, okay, had been shattered by a brick. And there was glass all over the floor and the brick on the floor. And he's just sitting there tapping the glass with his foot. He doesn't even look up when I walk in. All right. And he mutters, he says, "You know what really pisses me off about this?" And I said, "What?" He said that you didn't write anything this week to deserve this. And that if you can find yourself into an environment where you learn that part of the ethos,
Yep.
then you've learned everything else is commentary. That's how you learn the newspaper business. Because you affect people.
Is it possible to have that kind of education in a newspaper today?
I think so. It's harder. It's harder than it was. There are fewer newspapers.
Yep.
And the other thing, too, okay, is that in lieu of newspapers, you do have these endeavors, these virtual endeavors that are going to develop their own ethos as they go along. Okay, they're going to develop their own culture of get the story, of afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. Okay, they're going to develop their own ethos to get there. So it doesn't have to be the 1930s honey get me rewrite shit that I grew up on. Okay, there'll be something that's the equivalent of that. It's harder, and it's harder to make a living doing it than it ever was. We were never paid well, but we could at least buy a red hot beef and bean burrito at 7-Eleven and make it to the next deadline. It's going to be harder, but I still think it's possible. But more than just possible, I think it's essential. And I think the one thing I would say is, to the degree possible, for any young journalist, start local.
Why is that?
Start where because you can feel the impact. Because you're writing about people you see. You're writing about people you know. You're talking about the struggles of people whose lives, they matter to you because they're part of your community. And once that becomes part of who you are, it becomes easier to translate that to a state scale or to a national scale or to even to an international scale. The only difference, really, between a national story and a local one is the pronunciation of the names. The issues at the heart of all of these are all the same, and they're all about people. And the one thing that you have to do in all of those is understand that you're writing about people. You're not writing about issues. You're writing about people. And you're writing about people for people. And you have to write about it or talk about it in a way that appeals to what people are appealed to by. Yeah, the ideas matter. The ideas absolutely matter. The ideas are crucial. But you can't just talk to a person's head. You have to talk to their heart. And that's something that you learn when you're working the local newspaper, or when you're working the local site, or when you're working the local radio station, because these people are your people. And you start to understand that all people are your people.
Good.
You asked me before we got... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, go ahead. Keep going.
You asked me before we got started. I mentioned that one of the things that, one of the skills that I thought was essential, one of the things that I would ask any young journalist to do is write obits. Okay? And the reason is simple. All right, I'm going to move because it's starting to rain. The reason is simple. Okay? It's because those are the most human stories there are. And they're filled with lies. Pretty lies, we tell ourselves. Okay, I used to love sitting up late at night, that Wednesday night or that Tuesday night when we were finally putting the paper out and doing the obits.
Mm-hmm.
And, you'd get the story about the baseball coach who died, and they'd never talk. You knew the guy.
Right.
You knew the guy. Right. And you knew, okay, that, he was a wonderful coach, and he cared about his kids, and he cared about his kids. And you knew about his high school successes, okay? But what you never talked about was the fact that the guy spent his entire life regretting the fact that he went too fast around a turn and slammed into a telephone pole and blew his chance to ever make it to the big leagues.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so that part of the story was missing. And so any story you ever took thereafter, that hole in that story, you knew it was there. And you were always looking to fill that in every story you told. The wonderful woman, the wife and mother, the loyal, devoted wife, who was indeed a loyal and devoted wife, except for that one weekend in Vegas with her college friends.
Mm-hmm.
I always think a little bit about that one weekend in Vegas with her college in every story you ever did. It's always about the local story, and it becomes something more than that. Mm-hmm. Alexa, stop. You understand what I'm saying?
Say that again.
Yeah, Alexa, shut up. Oh.
So let's talk about some of the stuff that you've done. The 2 books of yours that I've read is Betting the Farm on Drought and then A Thirsty Land. Mm-hmm. Because in both of them have a lot to do with the place we both love, which is Texas. Mm-hmm. And neither one of us are from there. I've spent a lot of time there now, but I'm definitely not a Texan, as any Texan will tell me. So I was flipping through A Thirsty Land this morning, and I was reminiscing about the bit on Corpus Christi Bay, which is where I am. Mm-hmm. At one point, when I first started going there, because I've got family there, and they started getting these notices in the mail like "Don't drink the water." Mm-hmm. And then and that was because the drinking water had gotten polluted. And now I have successfully ridden out at least one hurricane on my boat in that bay, and I've done sailing orders out there. So it's a world I'm very familiar with. What made you decide to go to Texas to start working on stuff, and then kind of how did you end up there?
Well, that's actually a funny story, and it tells you a little bit about how miserable this business is.
Okay.
I didn't decide to go to Texas. In fact, the first time I was ever in Texas, I was 19 years old, making my first trip across country. Yeah. And we had a buddy of mine, a woman from the Upper East Side who was 45 years old at the time. I was 19. My friend was 18. She was 45. She spilled across the American panorama like a can of red paint. And we ended up out in Palo Duro Canyon. Mm-hmm. And it got there late at night. And I was having a conversation with a guy in a Winnebago, a Texan in a Winnebago. Okay. I don't remember what the hell we were talking about. It was a lovely chat, right? And, and bid him a good night. And I went back to our campsite to cook. And I realized I had left my can opener back in Missouri. All right. So I went back to the guy's Winnebago, knocked on the door. He was already inside at the point, okay, to borrow a can opener. I have a can of LeSueur peas in my hand. Mm-hmm. Door to the Winnebago flies open. Guy standing there in his boxer shorts, and he's got a pistol, okay, that he is pointing in my direction. What you want? I was like, I forgot my guy. I was just talking to you. I forgot my can opener. I mean, you could shoot the top off if you want. And the guy recognized me and got really apologetic and started fishing around in the drawers. Yep. For a can opener, but never took the gun off me. And it was like, no, oh, wait, I gotta. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's Texas. I am never going back. I am simply never going back. So I write End of Country.
Uh-huh.
And Random House did nothing to promote End of Country. That was the first book I had written. They had done nothing to promote it at all. And what happened is I ended up winning an award out in San Diego or something like that. And 6 months later, they call me up. And they say, "Oh, we're so glad we finally found you. You won this award, the Green Prize, and we called Random House, and they didn't know who you were." And I was like, I started to bitch on Facebook. I mean, I started to bitch on Facebook, and Gianna Lamort at University of Texas Press, who had, for reasons that escape me, been a fan of End of Country, turned around and texted me and said, "Can we have your next book?" And I was like, "It's yours. I don't care what it is. It's yours." And so I did Betting the Farm for them. And I absolutely, that brought me into Texas for the first time, literally since I was 19. And I started to wander around Texas. And much like you, Billy, I fell in love with the place. I fell in love with the culture. I fell in love with the contradictions. I fell in love with the diversity of the place. I came to realize that Texas, as much as Texans like to think of themselves as an independent republic, and as much as the rest of us like to think of them as a state, they're not really either. What it is an empire, a collection of culturally and geographically distinct areas held together by a myth, by the myth of the Texan. And I don't need to tell anybody what the myth of the Texan is. I mean, all I have to do is turn around and say Texan, and you conjure an image. We all conjure the same image of a Texan. What dawned on me was that when I go to Ireland, or I go anywhere overseas, okay, and I ask them to conjure a mythic American,
it's Texan, isn't it?
You know what they conjure for? They conjure a Texan.
That's right.
Okay. So in a way, Texas, you and I may not be Texans, but Texas is us.
Right.
In a way that no other place in America really is. It's a microcosm. That's why I write about Texas.
It's like Texas.
Even in the new book, there's a lot. There's a lot of Texas.
Unapologetic about themselves. Like like we're proud of it, and if you don't like it, go back to where you're from, because actually
Exactly.
And that's and that's one of the things I like about them, because they're just it's just sort of a no bullshit sort of I mean, I say that there's lots of bullshit there, but they don't care. It's just, this is who we are. And right now, I've got a good friend from Austin who's a firefighter, and he's relocating to Corpus because too many Californians are moving to Austin. And that's the thing. That's the other thing, is like Texans are going to be like, I don't know. We don't like this California influence, but so I don't know. That's the next great shift. Texas. We've probably talked about this, but the thing, especially down on the border at Brownsville, is this weirdness of South Texas culture. You go right across the border, you're in Matamoros, you're in Mexico. It's also, Brownsville is in one of the poorest counties in Texas, but then down on the coast, you've got SpaceX, building, Mars rockets. And there's just so many different things going on that absolutely don't seem to have anything connected with them, except that it's Texas and we're going to do what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you can turn around and be in the same state, all right, that has SpaceX reaching for the stars, and to sit down in Presidio, okay, with Luis Almendarez, and having him spend half an afternoon telling me about how he made the Adobe bricks, on his lumber yard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And have those not be contradictory.
Yeah.
Have those not be contradictory, but part of a whole, is what makes the place not only reflective of America as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
but also inspirational to it. Okay, also inspiration. So I have now fallen so much in love with Texas that I'm trying to persuade my wife, who's from Australia and never wanted to go anyplace dry again, to move to Texas.
Okay, if you go to Texas, where do you want to go?
I love the area around basically from Terlingua to Presidio. That's my favorite part. That's one of my favorite parts of the world. That are
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite parts of Texas. I just love the river there.
The
I just
thing
love the
that's
river.
really interesting for me geographically is because I'll drive from Texarkana down the coast, basically straight down to Houston and then down to Corpus.
Mm-hmm.
From Texarkana to Houston is all East Texas. It's all things green in East Texas, and it just kind of feels like South Arkansas. But geographically, the land and the climate shifts from the north side of Houston to the south side of Houston.
Yep.
And you get out on the south side of Houston, and suddenly it's mesquite trees, palm trees, no more pine trees, no more. And it, there's a little phasing out of live oaks, but in a real short span, and it's just one side of the city versus the other.
Exactly. Of course, yeah. You have to bear in mind that Houston is now the westernmost suburb of Atlanta. So I mean, it's like But yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's the other thing that amazes me about it is the change in topography. And so it's abrupt, I suppose, if you're looking at your odometer, but it still feels graceful. It still feels graceful. It doesn't feel like it's not jarring. It's just there's a thing about it that just says I'm going through a transition. Oh, of course,
right.
And you're there, and you're there. No, I've fallen in love with the place. I absolutely have fallen in love with the place. I've fallen in love with pretty much every square inch of it, but that part in particular.
It's the thing, and I guess it'll bring us back to the modern age, and then we can kind of segue into what you've been writing. So the Selena Memorial statue is, I can see it from the back of my boat. And back during the summer, they were having it wasn't a Trump rally per se, but it was a Trump rally in front of the statue. And then on the opposite side of the street was the counter protest. Both sides, because I started to walk over there, and then I saw it was there, and then I just promptly went back because both sides had people in it with AR-15s. And I thought, you've got 4 lanes of traffic, you're downtown, it's a busy area, and we've got 2 different protest groups that are now carrying semi-automatic, assault style rifles. And I thought, it doesn't take long for this to go bad. This takes one stupid person for this to get real bad real fast. Yeah. So that being said, let's talk about what you've been writing, because I haven't seen it. I've just heard you talk about it. What are you doing today?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of it.
So what are you writing these days? I've seen it. I mean, I've seen you talk about it, but I haven't actually, I haven't read anything.
Well, I think we kind of touched on it a little bit before. What the book is it's called From a Taller Tower. And it traces the history of mass public shootings, what we refer to as mass public shootings, an epidemic, a particular manifestation of the epidemic of gun violence. But it traces it from the tower at the University of Texas on August 1st, 1966. In one long arc, up to, but also beyond, the massacre at Las Vegas in 2007. And what I do in walking through that, first of all, I tell the stories through the eyes of people who survived them, through the eyes of people who investigated them, in a couple of cases, through the eyes of people who committed them. And I talk about all the myths that we've created to explain these things away. And the reason I call it from a taller tower is that I make the argument that what happened to the University of Texas on August 1st, 1966 was the rise of the modern mass public shooter. And all the myths that we've used to explain it away were stripped away in Las Vegas. And it became nothing but a taller tower, more firepower, and more victims, which is what these things are really about. They thrive in, this is what we talked about before, a culture that has commoditized victimhood and grievance, that has become narcissistic to the point of sociopathy. This is all taking place. Against the white noise of a culture that amplifies every one of those things, that amplifies victimhood, that amplifies this sense of grievance, that amplifies this sense of narcissism. So that in that fog of what this culture has become, it becomes impossible to see these guys coming. And that's what the book is really about. There's a moment in the book where I'm talking to a guy who's about 40 now. When he was 18 years old, just about the time he turned 18, he committed a mass shooting at a college in Massachusetts called Simon's Rock in the early 1990s. Okay. I'm having a conversation with the guy. And yeah, he's trying to tell me the guy is saying what I think, what I certainly want to hear. I don't know whether he's being sincere or not. And as I introduce him to you, I tell you how I evaluate him. I give you examples of how I evaluate him, but I leave it to the reader to evaluate whether he is actually being sincere or not. But I asked him at one point, I said, he had an AK-47 knockoff, an SKS. The only thing that kept him from killing more people was that the gun had misfired. I asked him at one point, I said, would a good guy with a gun have stopped you? And again, I'll leave it to the reader to evaluate this answer. I don't believe he was trying to deflect responsibility, though. I will say that. I said, would a good guy with a gun have stopped you? He said, I thought I was the good guy with the gun. And I think that is the essence, I think, of what the new project is really about. It's I rarely say this. I'm actually kind of proud of this one. And I'm kind of proud of this one both because of the way it approaches the storytelling, but the story itself, but also because of elements of the story, of the way it's told. This is something your journalism students may find interesting. People get numb to violence. People get numb to graphic images of bloodshed. There is almost no violence in this book. Almost none. There's only one of the mass shootings, and it doesn't even take place in the United States. It's the Christchurch shooting that I actually go into detail about the shooting itself. When I deal with Sandy Hook, for example, all right, the massacre in Sandy Hook, the way I bring the reader in is a debriefing afterwards. And there's an officer, a veteran officer, a member of one of the 4-man units.
Mm-hmm.
That they train as SWAT teams, interdepartmental units. They train as SWAT teams, and they're debriefing him.
Yep.
And he says, "I took perimeter. I took the perimeter." He's not telling the truth. He's not telling the truth. And they ask him again, and he says, "I took the perimeter." They know he's not telling the truth, but they also know that he's not lying to them. This cop, this veteran cop, this grown man who has trained for exactly this kind of situation, mm-hmm. and who has seen things in the course of his life that would fell a lesser man, was so overwhelmed by what he saw when he was one of the 4-man units that walked into the very first classroom that the killer walked into, that he erased the memory.
Yeah.
And replaced it with a false memory. If you want to turn around and gauge the weight of the kind of atrocities that we're talking about, without dwelling on the violence that we've become inured to,
mm-hmm.
that's how you tell that story.
I was
in
Las Vegas about a month after the Vegas shooting, and I was at a conference. It was a big Adobe conference, Adobe software, and mm-hmm. they threw in the was it the Wynn Hotel? I'm trying to remember which hotel it was. Mm-hmm. It was
the Mandalay Bay. Mandalay Bay was the one.
That's it. And there's a big banner over to the side of the hotel where the window had been broke out where he'd been shooting from. Like it was all, it was like, mm-hmm. We love Las Vegas, or I don't remember what it said. Mm-hmm. The thing I remember, we went to this party one night that they had, a big dance party kind of thing out there, and I could see that banner from where we were. Mm-hmm. And I mm-hmm. remember, and I've got a law enforcement background, and so what I remember thinking was, this is exactly the kind of thing, because it was a concert they were at, but I was, there were several thousand people at this thing. It was, and I was like, mm-hmm. and I just remember thinking, I'm in range. Mm-hmm. And I just sort of, and I'm trying to have a good time, but at the same time, there's this weight of this thing, like, and it's forever. I don't know if it's forever, but at least at that moment, I'm like, this is a shadow that's just going to hang here for a while.
It's a shadow. It's what I was talking about before about trauma. Mm-hmm. Okay. The trauma radiates out. I guess a year ago, April, there was a shooting at a synagogue in Southern California. Okay. Poway. Only one person was killed, so it won't count in our kind of grim definition of mass public shootings. But a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, who I've not seen face to face in 30 years, reached out to me. She knew I had been writing the book, but that wasn't why she reached out to me. She reached out to me because she had just watched her best friend die on the floor of the synagogue. Okay. And so this trauma that happened in San Diego was transmitted to me, and it will be transmitted down generations. The trauma of what happened in Las Vegas, hundreds shot, mm-hmm. will be transmitted down generations. And unless we turn around and find a way of addressing that trauma, that assault on what Richard Freeman refers to as the national limbic system. Mm-hmm. Unless we begin to address that, we're never going to stop that trauma. And we're never going to stop the seeds that allow these sorts of things to continue to develop. In fact, the trauma is one of the things that provokes these things. You look at the Amish school shooting in Pennsylvania back in 2007. A guy murdered in an Amish school. 10 only girls. He separated. He let the boys go, and he executed the girls because he wanted to get even with God for some reason. The loss of one of his own children, and so he executed them. Okay. There was a book written by a couple of guys out of Elizabethtown College, a few guys out of Elizabethtown College, called Amish Grace, which focused on the Amish forgiveness. Which is not like everybody else's forgiveness. It's a different species of theological event. Okay, but this was a very tender and respectful book. Okay, that dwelled not on the violence. When Sandy Hook happened, one of the few actual hard copy books that they found in that killer's home was Amish Grace.
Really?
The question was why? And the answer to that, I think, and I talk to people who've come to the same conclusion in the book, is this wasn't his list of mass killers. This wasn't his aspirational, I want to be like them. This was a book that was really about pain, about a community in terrible pain. And that became a benchmark for that killer, to inflict more pain. To inflict more pain than the killer at the Amish school had. If you have a culture that has as its white noise so much violence, narcissism, and the quest for fame, that a monster who would do something like that is not readily apparent to all of us.
Right.
Doesn't stand out in a way that we could see him coming a mile away.
Right.
That's quite an indictment of our culture.
Okay, so I'm torn between two questions. There's a statement and a question. I'll jump to one. I want to ask you about how you, and I'll ask this second after I say something else, about how you approach writing about this without it turning into tragedy porn. But the first is the personal story, and I shared it with you probably a year ago, how I ended up with an AK-47. I had a friend of mine reach out, for the people at home who don't know this story. I had a friend of mine reach out with an AK-47 for sale, and they're trying to sell it quickly, because the backstory is their 16-year-old son had purchased this thing from some guy on Facebook. But what made it worse was the way he got the money to purchase it. He was working at his job, and he stole money from his employer to end up paying, for this gun. And his employer caught him. And so now we have a 16-year-old with an AK-47, and his employer is threatening to send him to jail. And they were looking for somebody who could just unload it on, well, that was a bad way to say that. They were looking for someone to buy it off of him, or so they could, get themselves out of this bind. So I did. And the thing that disturbed me as much as that did is it would jam up. It was because, and then I pulled it apart and realized somebody had been messing with the trigger mechanisms, and and I was like, oh, someone who didn't know what they were doing or trying to convert this thing into a fully automatic from a semi-automatic. And, I took it to a gunsmith, had him fix it, and did exactly what, I think everyone, if you've got something like this, I unloaded it and stuck it in a safe, and it hasn't come out since. But I just remember thinking, oh, this is how this happens. Like, this is how a 16-year-old ends up with something like that. But, at the same time, I see people buying them things for their kids for Christmas now. So you've got that culture, which is a very different gun culture than I grew up with, which was more deer hunting. And nobody carried a handgun because it was you were actually kind of looked down upon if you carried a handgun. You're like, oh, you're not tough enough to, your fists aren't enough. You've got to resort to something like that. And I remember that being the attitude. So go into all that, because I just wanted to get that in there. But the other thing that I hit with the border reporting that I know you've hit with this is you just you encounter so many tragic stories. And after a while, one tragic story seems to bleed into the next tragic story. This family's traumatized for this reason. And then after a while, you put 100 of those together, it just sort of, again, it becomes a white noise of tragedy. And so, and how do you, from a writing perspective, like, how do you tackle that without it turning into tragedy porn?
Couple of ways. One of the things that you do is you focus on the stories that illustrate a different aspects of a particular problem. Okay. And so you end up, your primary goal is at that point is to turn around and make it not repetitive. Okay. The other thing is to turn around and not go in the direction that your reader is automatically going to expect you to go. Okay. When I talk about the Amish massacre, for example, okay, I want to give you an insight into the culture. I want to give you an insight into the mind, obviously, of the killer to the degree that I can. But the other thing that I want to do is I want to make it emotionally accessible to the reader without making it overwhelming. Okay. Or without turning around and making it familiar enough that they shut down. So I tell that story through the words of the first cop on the scene, who, after it's all over, won't tell his wife what happened, but simply goes up to his daughter's room, okay, who's about 2 at the time, takes her out of her bed, and just sits there in a rocking chair with her for 45 minutes. All right. In that piece, then we can begin to explore out without dwelling on the pornographic aspects of it. Okay. Now, after, there are times when you have to use other tricks, quite frankly. All right. There is a chapter in the book where I do go into some violence, and it's grotesque. It's the massacre at Christchurch in New Zealand. And I use that to kind of examine the chapter is called "'Tis Not All in My Inky Cloak." It's about how these guys wrap themselves into around with ideologies, but the reality is they're just killers. Okay, and these are just things to give them status. But that is a very, very, very disturbing chapter. It is a very disturbing chapter. And so to get out of that, all right, there is the next chapter, looks at Columbine, the Columbine shooters. It looks at the shooter at Simon's Rock, who I just told you about a moment ago, but it begins with a grotesquely comic image of 2 old jokers. One of them, a ridiculous clown who has a tattoo of Richard Nixon on his back, an absolute clown. Okay, a guy who, as I described him, looks like he's perpetually on his way to a dinner party at Dr. Frankenfurter's castle where meatloaf will be served.
Mm-hmm.
And he's with a kind of squeaky, gravelly voiced pod show and radio talk show host from Austin, Texas, who has earned the everlasting enmity. And they're at a shooting range.
Mm-hmm.
And I just depict them as total Shakespearean clowns as they shoot at these targets and turn around and squeal things like "right in the head." I cut from that immediately into one of the tapes that was preserved of the Columbine shooters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, doing exactly the same thing in a park outside of not far from their homes in the Rockies,
Right.
saying word for word, the same thing these clowns said on the tape in the shooting range. So I use not only to illustrate the point that I'm making, okay, but also to bring in literally Elizabethan clowns to reinforce the narrative, but at the same time provide some levity. At the same time, give the reader a bit of relief. They'll feel guilty about the relief at the end of that part, but at least gives them some relief. You understand what I'm saying?
Yep, I do. So what would you say about a pretty common strategy in warfare is you dehumanize your opponent, your enemy. And that is something I've seen definitely happen within the context of a lot of these shooters, but again, also within the context of a lot of American dialogue, political dialogue these days, is you're no longer you stop being a person, you become a thing, and you're a thing of that we despise. I remember walking through. I don't know where I was, but there was a TV with Fox News playing one day, and it had Alan West was on, and he made I remember him referring to Democrats as the enemy, as the enemies, and that was a shift from that was the first time I'd ever heard the word enemy actually used as opposed to like my opponent or something like that, or our friends on the other side of the aisle, and I remember thinking that's Civil War language. Like that's not political dialogue. That's something far darker.
It's sectarian. It's sectarian language. It's the kind of stuff. It's sectarian. It's gang. Okay, it's the kind of stuff you hear when you're in a when you're in the Middle East. It's the kind of stuff that you hear when you're in. Not as much as you did 20 years ago, but where you did used to hear among American gangs. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Okay. But here's the thing, though. That's only part of it. Part of it, obviously, you turn around and you get a guy like the truck driver who shot up the Tree of Life Synagogue in Mr. Rogers' old neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And sure, he cited all of the anti-immigrant nonsense. But the telling thing about him was this use of a phrase. This is a guy who never served a day in uniform.
Yep.
Okay. His use of the phrase throughout his life. I'm going in. And as if he were, the 82nd Airborne getting ready to jump behind enemy lines on D-Day when he's, basically going out to deliver pizzas for somebody. Okay. And then to turn around and massacre people at a synagogue. It's not just that rhetoric is out there and that rhetoric has become pervasive. It's that it gives these guys an opportunity to wrap themselves in that. I make the point when I look at this guy, for example, that if you turn around and break out this guy who was, in his late 40s, and a guy who was a few years older on the other side of the state, who used very much the same kind of language, had very much the same kind of life history, and shot up a municipal building, okay, during a meeting, killing 3 people.
Yep.
Because they had told him to clean up the junk in his yard.
Mm-hmm.
The actual motivation is really not that different. The actual motivation is a sense of grievance, a sense of victimhood, a sense of self-aggrandizement. What they choose to wrap it in, what they choose to turn around and use as the excuse to give them even greater standing in their pitiful little lives. That's now stuff we buy off the rack. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about the commoditization of grievance and the commoditization of rage and the commoditization of victimhood, that they've become cottage industries. These guys can just literally take the costumes off the rack now. But what they are at their core, is selfish, narcissistic, murderous losers. They're not. The guy who turned around and went on a 10-mile-long shooting spree in Odessa and Midland was probably a real racist. But that's not why he was a killer. He was a killer because he was a fucking killer. He was a killer because he was a killer.
Uh-huh.
He was a racist,
right?
Because of course that kind of stupid, useless creature would be drawn to that kind of stupid, useless philosophy. Of course he would be drawn to it. But that's not what defines him. He was that regardless. I'm saying he would have been that he was had the fairest star in the firmament twinkled on his bastardizing.
Uh-huh. See, this is where you're getting into Hunter Thompson mode. See, I can feel that, which brings me to a question. Someone who has really strong opinions, but is also has a lot of faith in the journalistic process of keeping your bias in check. How do you take what you do and your own personal beliefs, and when you sit down to write a story, make sure you're telling the real story and not just the version of the story you want to hear? Or
all right. I'll try. Here's the thing. For most of my career, Billy, I did everything in my power to keep my opinions out of my work. Mm-hmm. It was only when I started writing magazine stuff and book stuff, where that sort of thing was encouraged, that I even became a presence in my own work as a general rule. But now here's the thing, and this matters. I still try to be as rigorously accurate as I can, which means that I constantly have to challenge my suppositions, which means that I constantly have to represent the alternative point of view as accurately as I humanly can. Now, I am aware of many of my biases. Mm-hmm. I am aware of many of my prejudices. I am aware of many of my preconceptions. I am not aware of all of them. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons that I am, as a character, as present as I am in my books, is so that the reader may be able to see prejudices, preconceptions, and predilections that I'm not aware of. Mm-hmm. I try to be as upfront and honest about who I am as I'm exploring this, so the reader can't judge not just the answers to the questions that I pose, but the questions that I pose in the first place. To me, that's as close as I can possibly get. I cannot be objective. No one can. Right. Okay, we can try, but it's an ideal. It's like opera. You're never going to get it perfect.
Right.
All right. But what you can do is And there's another reason I do that, by the way. And again, this is something for your students if they move into this kind of writing. You want your reader to be able to evaluate the writer. You want your reader to be able to evaluate where you're coming from, what you've brought to it, what you asked, what you didn't ask. You want them to be able to do that so they can honestly evaluate the information you're presenting. But you also have to get them to come along with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? You also have to get them to come along with you. And people do not want to be lectured to.
Right.
They do not want to be talked down to. They do not want some pompous old white guy, all right, preaching at them. Every one of my books contains a character who is just a complete screw up. Okay, just everything he touches turns to shit. I mean, it's just, he tries, he's well-meaning, he tries, but you can see him screwing up as you go along. Okay, and because of that, the reader takes pity on the writer in that case. The reader takes pity on the narrator in that case and comes along with them and also is willing to correct them as they go along. Okay. And I've been blessed by having a complete screw up at my disposal. It just happens to be me, so it's like I have that at my disposal. And so I'm able to use it. Here's the one other aspect of it. And I don't know if this is helpful to your students either, but one of the things that I learned with the first book was that I always tell this story this way. When I was in college, for the 1 year that I was in college before they politely asked me to leave, if I had to read a book I really didn't like, there were 3 guys in a bar in South Wilkes-Barre who knew about it. We don't live in that world anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't live in that world anymore. A book is not the end of a process. A magazine article, a newspaper article is not the end of a process. Once upon a time it was. The most you could expect was a letter to the editor, a stern, certainly worded letter to the editor. Now it's the beginning of an ongoing conversation.
Yep.
And that's the other thing I think that is important to remember is that nothing that you put down on paper is ever the last word. It's never the last word. It's never the end of a conversation. It's always the beginning of one.
All right. So let me ask this question: what are you reading these days, or what do you think my students should be reading? What's some conversations that would give them a good insight of things?
I'm always reluctant to tell people specific things to read. Right now, I'm reading Woodward's book. Okay, which as I said, I am always in utter awe of his meticulous attention to detail. But the guy can't write it all. As Dennis Hamill said about the New York Times, it's like reading your lease. But I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to turn around and cite particular books. Although I did really enjoy the book on Sam Colt because I thought that touched on some larger cultural issues. Read history. Read history. Okay. Read recent history. Read books that put people first. But also, don't just write them. Pick up your local newspaper and read the obits. And read between the lines. Read between the lines.
Let me ask you, it's kind of following up on the Woodward book, in your own research, when do you decide that you've actually researched enough? Like when's like, okay, this is enough to write something down?
It's not a decision, it's an epiphany. It's an epiphany every time. No project I have ever worked on ever, okay, has resembled in any way, shape, or form what I thought it was going to be when I went in. Okay, in every single book, there's a conversation. There's a conversation that happens between, and I don't do interviews. When I interview somebody, it's kind of like this.
Yeah.
It's two guys sitting there, two people or three people sitting around talking. Okay, but there's always one moment that I walk out of one of these conversations and I go, there it is. There it is, because I've already thought it all through, and not even. Yeah, I mean, I've taken notes. I've done the hard work, and the work is hard because what I do is every piece of research goes into a file. Everything I read goes into a file, but every single word that's spoken, and I end up with 5,000, 6,000 pages of notes on a book. Okay, every single word is recorded, and so I hear it the first time, and then I transcribe it by hand. So I hear it again. Okay. And then I hear it again or read it again when I decide to use it. And what happens is all that stuff sort of gestates. And then somewhere along the line in End of Country, it was sitting down with a guy by the name of Ken Ely and him telling me about how he went to war when they ran over his blue tick coonhound. Okay, with the gas company. Okay, in betting the farm, it was that conversation with Ethan. Okay, sitting in his workshop outside his barn. Okay, where we talked about everything. Okay, then in Thirsty Land. It was stumbling into Haskell's office in Bay City, okay, and expecting to be lectured to because I had been warned that he would lecture me, until I noticed that there was behind his head a copy of Aidan Steinsalt's translation of the Talmud. And when I asked him about the Talmud and we started discussing Talmud, and it led me to the whole history of this Russian Jewish immigrant into this field that never would have been told otherwise. Right. In every one of those cases, when I walked out, I went, there it is. That's the book. And from there, all the other ideas just sort of intersect in that one incident, and you know where you're going.
That actually, okay, so this is a good point to segue into Ethan. One of the things that really struck me about that chapter, and it's your persona, and I think it's a lot of relevance in the world that we're living in right now, is you have this ability, as someone from the South, you'd just be considered one of those, Northern Yankee liberal types, who may be a little bit more crustier than others. But you've got this ability to sit down with somebody who may have a polar opposite outlook on life, and you guys can and you have the ability to have a conversation and find common ground with them, which is, I would imagine, what a lot of, we need a lot more of in this world. Hey, what are your thoughts first?
I think there's a lot more of it than you might think. What's that?
Yeah. So first, tell everybody about Ethan Cox, because I don't imagine they don't know.
Well, Ethan was a guy. Some local farm journal had written a story about some of the stuff that he was doing, and what had happened is he had made it through 2 back-to-back years of devastating flooding. Okay, this is a guy who had never been off his farm except for once when he was a kid. He'd been out to New Mexico. He'd never been more than a few miles from the farm in his entire life because the cows wouldn't let him go. And he was doing a lot of corn, and he was doing a lot of beef, but he was doing a lot of corn. And 2 years back to back, he was he was flooded out. Okay, and very nearly, he was on the balls of his youth. And I guess was it 2012?
Mm-hmm.
2012. He noticed that things hadn't frozen up the way they usually do. And he read that as a harbinger of a drought year. And he figured that if he planted early, if he planted like a month early, he might be able to bring the corn in before the worst of the drought hit, and thereby save the farm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The problem was that the bean counters who do crop insurance don't like it when you vary from the norm. And so if he planted a month early, they weren't going to give him any coverage at all. All right. They weren't going to give him any crop insurance at all. So if he was going to do this, if he was going to rely on his instincts, now this was a guy who is not ideologically, politically, religiously, frankly, predisposed to believe in anthropogenic global climate change, but who is looking at it and rising to the challenge nonetheless. And he just calls it farming. I mean, that's all he calls it.
Right.
But he was literally betting the farm that there was going to be a drought. Okay, because if he was wrong, he'd lose everything. If he was wrong, he'd lose everything. Okay. Now here's the deal. Okay, I'm not going to tell your students whether or not he bet right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're going to have to read the book to figure that out. All right. But I will tell you this. I will tell you that I needed to talk to him, and he did not want to talk to me in the worst way. He didn't want to talk to me at all because, as he told his daughter, who had literally quit her job and moved back to the farm so she could farm with her dad and be with him on this big bet, he'd never met a liberal before. He'd never met a liberal, and where would he meet one? I mean, there aren't any in Whitehall, Illinois. Okay. He didn't want to talk to me, but she eventually talked me into it. Okay. And I will tell you that the minute we sat down, and I come in and you sit down, have a cup of coffee with him, we go out to the workshop, and the minute we sat down, I felt just an affinity for the guy.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, he may have been farming a lot more than we farmed growing up. But he was doing the same things that the old guys in my neighborhood used to do, you know? And so we ended up in conversations about that. And the conversation just drifted. Now, the other thing, I didn't do this on purpose, but Ethan had a heart attack, I guess about 3 or 4 years before, and had to quit smoking. And he was just thrilled. Okay, absolutely thrilled that I would be smoking in his presence, so he could at least smell it. He would like breathe deep every time I roll one. But we just hit it off, you know, and it was the same. It's always that there's always something you have in common. There's always something you have in common. And you start there, you know, and in that we talked about abortion. Okay. And we talked about, we talked about Second Amendment rights, and we talked about same-sex marriage, and we were on opposite ends of the spectrum ideologically in every one of those issues. But when you turned around and started talking about people you knew who had been touched by those issues, or their own responsibility in those kinds of things, these two old white guys from opposite ends of the political spectrum really have a lot more shared values than we have differences. It's really a difference in approach. And as I said, and he ended up agreeing, you know, we talked about literally every major hot button issue in the culture at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And about 85% of the time, when it came down to the personal, we agreed. There was maybe 10% where we disagreed, and that was policy.
Mm-hmm.
But we could see where each other was coming. It was about 5% where, he thought I was nuts and I thought he was nuts. But we could set those aside, particularly in that kind of environment. And I said to him, I said, so why is it, Ethan, okay, that when you hear people talking about me and I hear people talking about you, the only thing they ever talk about is that 5%.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to what we were talking about before, because there's an industry that's grown up to exploit and commoditize those differences and the rage and the victimhood that are part of this.
Yeah, they
As long as you can turn around and steer it. Now, it's more difficult to do that now. Okay, it's more difficult to do that now. Partially because we're in an election cycle, but also because it has reached, as we began talking, this point where it's all coming at once. Where it's all coming at once, and we're in the cacophony. We're in the throes of the storm. We're in the teeth of the hurricane.
Do you think it's easier? Do you think it's easier to buy into a caricature of who someone is while you're in the middle of trauma? Like if you're in the middle of this sort of traumatic world, it's easier for me to put a label on you, and that just boxes you there, and I can do away with nuance.
Well, absolutely, but it's not. It's partially during trauma, but it's also because of the complexity of the world.
Mm-hmm.
We are wired. When you're in a traumatic situation, and I'm sure you've had moments in your life moments of pure white knuckle terror in your life. Things become very black and white. Mm-hmm. Things become very black and white. They become silhouettes and caricatures of themselves in times of immense stress. That is true. Okay, but the other thing, the thing that I think complicates it somewhat, is that we live in a world that is maddeningly complex. We live in a world that is things are complicated and technologically sophisticated and connected very often in ways that we can't immediately suss out. And we are wired as human beings to look for the silver bullet, to look for the single unifying theory, okay, to look for the answer for everything. And that requires knocking off all the rough edges. That requires, in these kinds of situations, going to the who said of greatest magnitude, and the who said of greatest magnitude to broadcast at the broadest depth is going to turn around and present the simplest, most cartoonish image they possibly can. So it's not, the problem is twofold. The problem is, one, the complexity of the world that we live in, and that's going to take some doing. The other is that we are in a moment of crisis. And when you are in a moment of crisis, that natural instinct to simplify, to caricaturize, becomes amplified. We'll get through the moment of crisis. We will get through the moment of crisis. Then we have to address the underlying problem. And to be frank, I'm not sure how we do that, except through narrative, except through storytelling.
One of the things that you do kind of on this topic, one of the big divides that I've witnessed is it's not right versus left. It's urban versus rural. Because I don't know, a lot of rural areas are afraid to go to urban areas. You're an hour and a half out of New York City. One of the things that you do, I think is really interesting, is going back to the motorcycle. Is I think you said on Facebook a while back, when you do book tours, you always do it on you take your motorcycle. Why? I know why I would do it. Why do you do it?
Well, a couple of reasons. One, because I'm incredibly cheap.
Gas mileage.
And so I end up pitching a tent behind the Relax Inn in Arkansas. But that's one reason. The other reason is that I everything I know, I learned um, from talking to people,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm forced, okay, to talk to people. I'm forced to visit. This idea of a rural-urban divide,
Mm-hmm.
I think even that's an oversimplification. Okay, I mean, you go into certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn, okay, and the only thing that's different from certain neighborhoods in Mississippi is the accent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The same cultural prejudices exist at the same time. Okay. There are places I've been in Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas. Okay. Where I've seen the kind of enlightenment
Mm-hmm.
that one would ordinarily ascribe to, an affluent, more urban environment. Okay. I have seen the kind of poverty that I see in places like Camden.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen them in the Rio Grande Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think this is an arbitrary distinction. I think this is an arbitrary distinction. I think people do tend to buy into it. I think people in rural communities buy into it.
Mm-hmm.
I think people in urban communities buy into it. Okay. But I don't think it's necessarily really legitimate. I think, again, in the same way that, a guy from Pennsylvania and a farmer from Southern Illinois, um, on completely opposite ends of the political spectrum, we're able to find places where they overlap and agree. I think you find that too. There are class, cultural, economic problems that beset America's cities
Mm-hmm.
that are a different genus of the same species of problems that affect. They're part of Pennsylvania we refer to as Pennsyltucky. I live in the Appalachians, this whole kind of Appalachian ridge that runs down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a different genus, but the same species of poverty. Um, and the representations of it, the manifestations of it, are not that different. Okay,
Uh-huh.
a certain kind of crime, certain kinds of violence, certain kinds of addictions,
Mm-hmm.
certain kinds of educational issues, certain kinds of emotional problems, certain kinds of psychological problems, certain kinds of domestic problems. Um, these are problems that have to do. They don't have to do with color. They don't have to do with geography. They have to do with class. They have to do with economics. Um, they have to do with opportunity. Ultimately, the response to them, I think, has to come there. The idea is that for so long, and there's a history of this that really dates to I think the late 1960s, the Nixon era,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Reagan era, and then to some degree the Clinton era,
Mm-hmm.
um, where we began to locate this certain kinds of problems in the cities, certain kinds of issues in the rural communities. Um, they're really more similar than they are different. And I think the distinctions were frankly made for political purposes,
Mm-hmm.
part of the industry that seeks to exploit problems
Mm-hmm.
to turn around and grievances and divisions. I think there is more that unites us than divides us.
Mm-hmm.
And again, once we get through this crisis, I got to tell you, I have lived in some fairly tough urban areas, and I have spent a good portion of my life, as now, in rural areas. I see a lot more similarities in the crises that both of those places face than I see differences. But I do see people turning around and trying to exploit those differences for very, very political ends.
Let me shift to something else, kind of, since you mentioned culture a little bit. A few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, first I went to Scotland and Ireland. Well, I went to Dublin. You told me I didn't go to Ireland because I only went to
Yeah, you didn't go to Ireland, you went to Dublin.
I realized, especially
Where the
Scotland.
Vietnamese woman served you a full Irish breakfast in a place owned by a Greek. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that. What I realized from that trip is I don't think I fully appreciated the culture I grew up in, or not appreciated, understood the culture I grew up in until I went there. Like until I spent a couple of weeks in Scotland, I didn't understand Ozark culture, and then it made sense. Like I was like, oh. Right. It was really obvious to me. These are the people that my people came from. Ireland is obviously really important to you. So, what? Okay, as you being you, why is Ireland still important?
For a couple of reasons. Okay, one, because I am what I am. I am a product to a very great extent of my family's history. All right. If I have a facility with language, it's because I was raised in a culture that valued that. If I'm a bit of a contrarian, it's because I was raised in a culture that expected that. Okay. But it also, the difference between you and me is that I think we're different types of Irish. Okay. And what I mean by that, okay, is that I was raised in an Irish Catholic environment. Okay. And that particular culture, once it took a very long time for it to assimilate, but once it did, I always make the running joke is that, you know, people will turn around and say, you're white. I say, well, I'm Irish. We've only been white since Bing Crosby. But when we did assimilate, we became, frankly, as bad as any wasp. Okay, in terms of enforcing a status quo. Visiting my family history reminds me of why I need to be more active in helping to bring into the tent people who are still viewed as being outsiders or second-class citizens. That's part of it. Okay, that's an obligation, I think, of anybody who is an Irishman, okay, or an Irish American, to understand that, you know, my great grandfather, when he came to this country, changed his name from McGrath, McGrath, to the more Protestant sounding McGraw, because he thought that it would make things easier for him. It didn't. He still ended up hacking his goddamn lungs out of the mines. Okay. It didn't make things any better for him at all, because he was what he was, and he was seen as that. And we need to remember that that's not that far in our past. There's another reason, though, Bill. And this is as the storyteller in me. Okay, this is the writer in me. When my great grandfather came over, it was an echo of the first famine. It was a famine in the 1880s, and he came over under questionable circumstances at that time. I still can't get anybody on that side of the ocean to explain to me exactly what he did, but it seems like they were all glad to have him gone. That said, he never, ever, from what I understand, talked about the old country at all. At all. Okay, not word one, except for one thing. He would talk about how when he was a kid, his mother would can vegetables that she grew in her garden, which was a feat in itself because this is a coastal area. It's right near Black Sock Bay. Really inhospitable terrain. And she would can the vegetables that she would grow, and she would sell them to the neighbors. And she got tired, as the story goes, of the bog trotting neighbors bringing in mud into her home. And so she had my great grandfather build a little alcove at the back of the house. Mm-hmm. And the woman was really short; she was maybe 5'2". And so the window had to be built really, really, really low. Okay, so she could hand this out. And my great-grandfather told my grandfather about this. Just that. Mm-hmm. Nothing else. Just that. My grandfather, of course, had never seen the place. My grandfather told my father, who had never seen the place. Mm-hmm. And my father told me. And about 25 years ago, I managed to find Paula Thomas in the most godforsaken corner of County Mayo. And I managed to find the house. And it's still in the family. Mm-hmm. And it's now a cow barn. Okay. But I walked into it, and it was exactly as he had described it. I walked into this place I had never set foot in, never seen, and I knew every inch of it. Mm-hmm. The window was exactly where it had been handed down from 3 generations. So now, when each of my kids turned 13, mm-hmm. Okay, I took them to Ireland. Okay, I took them to the cow barn. I told them the story, and I showed them the place so that they can know that there are some stories that are true, even if you've never seen them. That this fact, in perfect representation, managed to make it down 3 generations, gives me great hope for the power of storytelling.
Okay, to follow that up, for the storytellers that are just beginning their journey, not so much technical information but mindset information, like what advice would you give to a young storyteller as far as their soul and their mind and the way they should sort of approach the world?
Be quiet. It's not your story. It's not your story. The best storytellers tell other people's stories. It's going to filter through your experience. Listen. Fill in those gaps. Fill in those spaces between the lines and the obits. Okay, by listening. The stories will tell themselves if you just get out of the way. You just have to get out of the way. Everybody's got a magnificent story. I've never met a person. You asked about the bike. When I travel, I ride Triumphs, right? Okay, and one of my Triumphs is, it looks like an old, it's not, but it looks like, a 1960s Triumph Bonneville. And so every time I stop for gas, literally every time I stop for gas, some 75 or 80-year-old man is going to walk up to me. Okay, tell me about the Triumph he had. Okay, tell me how he met his wife on it. Okay, tell me about these remarkable nights he had on the Triumph, and I'm just going to listen. Okay, and I'm just going to listen. And every story I hear, even if I don't use it, is going to inform the way I hear the next story. Your job is simply to transmit the story. Okay, your job is not to be the story. At some point, yeah, you're going to want to turn around and tell your own story. You're going to want to be your own character, but you're going to want to be your own character. You're going to want to tell your own story in service of somebody else's story. Ultimately, writing is a service profession. It's never about you. It's always about somebody else. Otherwise, it's just self-indulgent.
There you go. Okay, last thing, anything we didn't cover that you want to just talk about? Do you got any good stories?
How long have we been doing this?
We're about to eclipse the 2-hour mark, but you know what? I don't care.
Well, I'm frankly tired of hearing me. So,
okay. So all right, then we'll just wrap it up. So, all right, Seamus. Okay, then how, if somebody's listening to this and they want to follow your work, they want to follow you, how might they do that?
Okay, I'm going to do the same thing I always do everywhere. All right. Okay. I'm Seamus. I'm Seamus McGraw on Facebook. I'm Seamus McGraw on Instagram. I'm Seamus McGraw on Twitter. My email is seamusm@ptd.net. And I'll tell you what, I'll even give you my home phone number. It's 570-588-6000. Like I say, these are like the books. These conversations are the beginnings of conversations. So anybody who wants to use me as a resource, feel free to use me as a resource. Anybody want to bounce a question off me in person, knock yourself out. I'm available all the time because I truly have no life.
All right. Seamus, I certainly appreciate this conversation. I told you I've been looking forward to this. You did not disappoint. So thank you.
I'm having a ball.
All right. So we're going to wrap it up, and I'll probably post this next week. So, all right. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Bill.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.